Hi, government folk. This screencast is to help you understand how we take the political spectrum from one-dimensional to make it two-dimensional with an X and a Y axis. Last week we talked about the political spectrum in terms of liberal and conservative, but it was only, as you see here, one horizontal axis. We talked about the idea of social issues and how typically conservatives are people who favor more government involvement in social issues such as banning something like gay marriage or restricting abortions, or even creating some law that makes English the official language of the United States. Whereas liberals are typically people in favor of less government involvement in social issues, like allowing, for instance, gay marriage or abortion or multiple languages in the United States. We also talked about economic issues and how liberals typically are people who favor more government involvement in the economy, more socialist tendencies, higher taxes, creating more equality, but also conservatives on the right here favoring less government and more capitalism. Now, the way we make this two-dimensional is by taking one of these triangles, getting rid of it, and inserting it as a vertical. And if you look at this accurately right now, you see that we basically have a y-axis with economic issues and an x-axis with social issues. I'll make that a little bit more clear right here. As I said, our x-axis are social issues ranging from socially liberal to socially conservative, and our y-axis deals with the economic issues from conservative to liberal. So as you can see, we can place people in these quadrants, which we'll be doing today. So first, let's look at the economics issue, which is on the y-axis, and let's pretend like we have somebody at this dot out here at the bottom. So this person, if you look at this chart correctly, is someone who is extremely liberal economically, but they have no position in terms of socially because they are in the middle of the x-axis, but they're all the way down here at the bottom of the y. Now, as we move this dot up, this person becomes what we call centrist, or somebody who's moderate in terms of economic and social issues. And as we move the dot all the way up, we see somebody who's extremely conservative economically, but still they're in the middle on social issues. So truly, there is no difference between this bottom person socially and this top person. The only difference is how they feel about economics, because again, the dot is only moving along the y-axis. So let's take a look at social issues on the x-axis. Let's imagine we have somebody, again, who's all the way over here on the left, somebody who's extremely liberal socially, but they have no opinion in terms of economics. If we move them to the middle, they'd be a centrist or a moderate. And if we move them all the way to the right, they have the same perspective economically, but they're extremely conservative when it comes to social issues. All right, so that's kind of how you can read these axes. We'll do a little trickier one here. Let's say we have somebody who's not right on an axis. They're up in this quadrant here. And if we match up where they're at on both the x and the y-axis, we see that this is a person who is socially liberal, which you should understand means that they don't want much government involvement, but economically conservative, which also means they don't want much government involvement. So if we put our triangles back in here, and remember these triangles kind of represent how involved the government is, you can see that this is a person where they want no government involvement in social lives, and they also want no government involvement in economic lives. Okay, so this, if we flip this and we go to this other quadrant here, we see that now instead we have somebody who wants a lot of government involvement socially and also a lot of government involvement economically, right? So they would want a very strong government, whereas somebody in this quadrant over here would want a very weak or non-existent government. All right, so this is how this quadrant can help us. It's a lot more complicated than just a horizontal line, but it also allows us to identify people and where they stand on their economic and social issues a lot easier. So with that, let's go ahead and we're going to move forward and add a few things. Each quadrant kind of has its own name in a way that can help you understand it. So first one, we're talking about somebody who does not want government involvement at all. They're in this upper quadrant. We call this a libertarian. If you see a word here, you'd probably notice the word liberty. Right? Somebody who's a libertarian doesn't want the government involved economically or socially. On the right, this idea of somebody who wants government involved in their social lives but not in the economy is what we talked about last week as somebody who's a classic conservative. Somebody on the left here, or the bottom left, is somebody who would want the government involved in the economy, but not much in terms of their social lives, which is a classic liberal, as we talked about last week. And then on the bottom right, we haven't talked about this yet, somebody who wants the government not only involved socially, so they're conservative socially, but they also want the government involved economically, so they're economically liberal. We call people like this populists. You also might hear the word communitarian. Both of them are kind of interchangeable, but we'll use the word populist in this unit. So now we can also not only plot people on this, but we can plot countries. So for instance, if we take a look at a country like Mexico, one thing you might understand about Mexico is that Mexico is, as a whole, a country that is left of center on social issues. Okay, so they're more liberal on social issues, and you also notice that they're much more capitalist as some other countries that I'll be putting up, right? So they are leaning towards a libertarian type country, not much government involvement in people's lives socially or economically. Another country that it would be in a different quadrant, if you look at Holland and a lot of other European countries for that matter, are countries that are quite liberal when it comes to social issues, okay, but meaning they don't want the government involved much, and also quite liberal when it comes to economic issues where they do want the government involved. So Holland is a place, as you see down here, where taxes exceed 50% of an individual's income, and individuals also have a lot of social freedom in order to do what they want. Saudi Arabia is a country you guys are probably familiar with from what we talked about this year. It's a country that's an absolute monarchy, and as you notice, it is extremely conservative when it comes to social issues. Okay? Saudi Arabia, if you remember, is a country where women are not allowed to drive, not allowed to leave the home without the help of a man, because it's a strict theocracy and therefore is very socially conservative. However, you also will notice, if you're looking at the y-axis, that it's economically a pretty free country. Okay, while it's socially it's not very free, economically it is. People don't pay high taxes, there's a lot of private goods, and therefore, because of the oil that they have and other resources, it's a pretty successful economy. Down here at the bottom, we see China. All right, and now China is another country compared to Saudi Arabia that's extremely conservative socially on the x-axis, but also the government is very involved in terms of economics. Okay, it's become more capitalist. If we look at China in the 1980s, the government was extremely involved in the economy. Since then, it has loosened its control a little bit. But think about, where will China be in 2020? We're talking about 8 years from now. It'll probably continue to progress up in this direction and only become more and more capitalist as their economy grows. So I'm going to click forward here and add just a few more countries that you can see here. North Korea, a country that's extremely strict on social issues, and also the government's very involved. England and the United States are very similar in terms of social issues on the x-axis, but you can see economically the United States is a little bit more conservative. There's Canada. Venezuela is a country where they're much more socially strict and the government's much more involved. It's more socialist. So you see all these countries on here that you can get an idea about. Looking up here, you see Ecuador, which is a country that's extremely capitalistic, a place where police are oftentimes private. You have to hire them. You don't get them through your tax dollars. So this is an idea about how we can use this four-quadrant chart in order to chart countries. Let's talk about some of these specific differences, and this is a good example between Iran and the United States in terms of social issues. Iran is a country, let me jump back first off. The United States is a country where we're having a debate about whether gay marriage is okay. In Minnesota, we're voting on an amendment in November on whether to restrict marriage between a man and a woman. In Iran, so basically we're talking about, we're very socially liberal in terms of gay marriage. In Iran, they're talking about whether or not it's okay for people to hold hands and kiss in public. So two totally different concepts about what is appropriate in terms of social freedom. We're talking about gay marriage. In Iran, a country that would never even think about talking about gay marriage, is talking about whether or not it's okay for people to hold hands and kiss in public. Now, in terms of this four-quadrant chart, we've been looking at the entire world. Now we're going to focus on this shaded area, which kind of illustrates where the United States is and where our opinions range. So imagine this next chart, we're focusing on just this area here. All right, so if you notice at the bottom, instead of Communism, I now have replaced that with socialism, because as we've talked about before, there aren't very many people in the United States that are cheering for communism. Socialist is about the most liberal any people get economically. So now we can take this chart and we can focus on the United States. And if we look at the center here, people who are in the middle in terms of economics and social issues, but we take away this bottom chart because most people in the United States are not favoring stronger government in terms of social issues and economic issues. So these would be our moderates in the United States, people who fall within the middle. Also sometimes are called centrists. As we expand, you're going to see the two major political parties in the United States and how they fit into this. We have Democrats, who, if you'll notice, are shifted left on the x-axis, more socially liberal, and also shifted down on the y-axis in terms of economics, favoring more socialistic tendencies, higher taxes, more social welfare programs and things like that. Then we have Republicans, who are more conservative, shifted up on the y-axis in favoring capitalism, but also shifted right on the x-axis in favoring more a social order and a clear right and wrong, more government involvement. Now notice that both overlap the middle because both political parties want a broad base where they have as many voters as possible, where they are attracting people on the more outer extreme edges like this, but also people in the middle. In the debate last week between President Obama and Mitt Romney, you would have noticed maybe that both candidates, especially Mitt Romney, kind of raced to the middle, people said, in order to try and seem more moderate so they could capture as many of these voters as possible. We had a few more political parties that are mainstream parties that you'll see when it comes to election time. Here's a list of them, and I'll line them up with you. This top one in the middle here we call the Tea Party. On the far left quadrant, we see libertarians, people who want hardly any government involvement. Notice the Tea Party is extremely conservative when it comes to economic issues. The Communist Party, although not super popular, does exist in the United States, and they favor extremely social economic tendencies where they want the government involved. The Constitution Party is a more conservative party, and the reason they call themselves the Constitution Party is that they want to go back to the way things used to be when the Constitution was written. They think it should be interpreted as it was intended in the late 1700s when it was written. And then the Green Party is a more liberal party that broke away from Democrats, and they focus on the environment mainly, where they get their name, the Green Party, and also anti-war efforts. Going back to the Tea Party up here, which has become more and more popular in the last few years, there are many people in the Tea Party that are on the x-axis. They're either socially conservative, and I'll click back so we can see that, way over here like a Michelle Bachmann, but there are also people who are more libertarian that are part of the Tea Party who don't want the government involved in social issues. So typically what we do is we put the Tea Party right here, particularly because technically the Tea Party, when you look at their base and you look at their platform, they have no opinion when it comes to economic issue or when it comes to social issues. They're strictly speaking about economic issues like lowering taxes, reducing the size of government, cutting entitlement programs like welfare, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. So now you see how we can use this four-quadrant axis to really give us an in-depth look at the people and the political parties in the United States and whether they are socially conservative or socially liberal and economically conservative or economically liberal. So hopefully this helps you understand these concepts. You'll have questions about this on your formative quiz that you're doing this week. And AP students, you'll notice that this looks a lot like the one in your chart or in your book, only some of the axes are flipped around, and these things will certainly be on assessments coming up in the future. So rewatch this if you need help understanding it again, and be ready to ask questions when we have class again. Thanks.